Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last session of COP-OFF. It's been an amazing 3 days, and I'm very happy that this final session will be on a very important topic, and that is destroying the gender hierarchy and the possible feminist ecology. And I think without this topic, in my humble opinion, we cannot talk about the end of destruction of nature and the planet. And in this sense, it is a very great honor to have with me tonight Sabrina Fernandes, an eco-socialist activist from Brazil. She's been doing a lot of things, and among all her work that she's been working on, she has been promoting synthesis of fragmented Brazilian left, which I think is very important. Welcome, Sabrina, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's good to be here, to close the day for COP-OFF. Thanks for having me.
Yes, we're closing with the session, and I'm really happy about it. And I'm happy that we have this topic on tonight. And so, because of course, COP-OFF wouldn't be we wouldn't have it if we didn't have COP26 that recently we had. And you're, of course, very active in concrete activist struggle in Brazil. Brazil also being under great attack because of the deforestation of the Amazon, Bolsonaro's regime, which we know is clearly anti-ecological. And so now at the end of COP26, with all the empty promises, the lack of progress on the rich and poor country agenda, the global south and the global north, if we can call it, and also the lack of really reaching some important gender issues during COP26. They maybe mentioned a little bit about women being threatened by climate change and problems with reproductive health, but not the real feminist agendas. So what is your opinion on COP26 and also on this topic of, if we can call it, ecofeminism?
Yes. I actually got back from Glasgow a couple of days ago. So there was a lot of tension actually related to gender issues, because even though during COP26 they had a gender day and we were supposed to be discussing that and putting that in the forefront, there was even some attempts by some delegations to say, well, it's not really important to put gender in the middle, because if we put just like human rights, then that's enough, right? So it's not that necessary to put the focus on women. But of course, the UN has come out and has said that 80% of migration related to climate change is coming from women and children. So children normally connected to these women. And so this is something that was kind of important to get the conversation going. Some of the countries promised a little bit more funding for women's empowerment, for education and leadership connected to fighting climate change. But we know that's quite not enough, because if we're looking from a perspective of a feminist ecology, there are other things that need to be at the center of the conversation, right? So when we mean feminist ecology, we're talking not just about the gender hierarchy in the sense of patriarchy and the fact there's a lot of oppression of women in society, but what are the mechanisms of this oppression? So then we're required to talk about time, we're required to talk about care, and how value is actually distributed in society, right? So what kind of work that is valued economically, what kind of work is seen as, well, this is not worth anything, or just because it's invisible at home. And this is really connected to ecological issues, because, for example, when we take into consideration how in some countries, when a community doesn't have proper access to water, it is women who are responsible for actually walking for miles to get water for the family. This is about time, this is about food, because there are estimates of women sometimes spending 27% of their calorie intake for the day just carrying these nutrients home. And so it's about health, it's about time, it's about care, having their responsibility, and their responsibility is not shared equally in a gender perspective. And it's about how this is the type of work that's absolutely necessary to sustain life, but it's not really taken into consideration when people are talking about the growth of the economy, or how important that country or the community is for the economical system, right? So the gender disparity is quite present there as well. And then this brings us to the consideration of the impacts, right? So what are the impacts, not just in terms of migration, but what if water scarcity gets worse? As we know, it will get worse in many places. What happens when we're talking about extreme weather events? So Carbon Brief came out with like a publication a while back showing a literature review of many studies. And these studies actually pointed out that, like, the majority of the studies pointed out that extreme weather events affect women a lot more than men. That's not to say that it won't affect men. That's not what it means at all. But we do see the disparity here. So it has to do with, who has access to proper shelter. It has to do with, for example, when we're considering women farmers who are very connected to subsistence farming in parts of the global south. Well, they're working under extreme heat, so they will be more affected. And if they don't work, how are they going to feed their families? So there are many things connected to this. Or when we're talking about poverty and we have data that women are more likely to suffer from poverty in the world. What does it mean, for example, when you have a hurricane and we're talking about like families that are like headed by single women and their children, and if they can't find shelter? So these extreme weather events is something that we really have to take into consideration. So when we're talking about, for example, something that's pretty big at COP, at least should be bigger, but it's something that we discussed a lot during the past week: loss and damage. The climate change is already something that's going on. So we already have loss and damage. And some of the countries, they really refuse to create a proper fund for loss and damage, saying that humanitarian aid is enough. But if we have proper negotiations where we can talk about loss and damage and how this impact loss and damage is very gendered as well, then we could perhaps come up with a different approach on how to protect women who are affected from even worse outcomes.
And which countries were against it? You just mentioned there were some countries that were against giving funds to the loss and damage fund.
Yeah, a lot of the discussions coming from a loss and damage fund were coming from the least developing countries that they really wanted to establish this. But the countries that normally say, the richer countries that normally say that, well, we already give a lot of humanitarian aid, so this is enough. So there was a lot of tension in some of these negotiations around it. In the end, in the final text, actually, the Glasgow Climate Pact, a few things were included. So from the beginning, the first part of the pact, they talk about how they acknowledge that climate change is a common thing, but it has different impacts, and we need to have a certain sense of obligation to indigenous communities, to people with disabilities, to migrants, to children, to women. So taking those things into account. But we do understand that even though this language of gender is there, or the gender of the language around empowerment of women is there in the ACE, which is the Action for Climate Empowerment, which was part of the negotiations as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's taken into account the principles of a feminist ecology. And because in the matter of climate finance, for example, one of the biggest concerns is that we still came out of this COP26 without a proper agreement between all of the parties on what climate finance actually means. Because, well, for underdeveloped countries that are already very much in debt, if climate finance just means more loans, this is not a good thing, right? So it maybe should be grants, but then other countries, richer countries or more connected to major financial institutions, think that, well, loans should count towards climate finance as well. So this was a big discussion over the past 2 weeks.
Yeah, and when you're saying this, I'm also thinking about the whole ecofeminism story, because a lot of people, when I sometimes mention ecofeminism, ask me, what is ecofeminism? And then I'm like, okay, so it's a very long story. It has a long history, but it is a way in which we show how there is a relation between nature exploitation and gender inequality. But then the biggest problem with ecofeminism is that that ecofeminists were in a way had a problem of lacking to talk about the race, class, and the geography where you are born. And I think what you were just mentioning is the issue that we cannot even talk about this ecofeminist issue with not talking about this global capitalist exploitation issue where the world is divided between the north and the south, the richer and the poorer countries. So because you were there, I'm very interested if you were among these people that were in the feminist groups discussing about these issues, and did you have any kinds of discussions like with women from developed countries, and did you have some arguments with them how this ecofeminism should be approached in the future to make it more ecofeministic, if we could say?
Yeah, well, this was despite having about 40,000 people in Glasgow coming for the COP. This was the most exclusionary COP because it actually, because of the pandemic, vaccine apartheid, and situations even related to like really ridiculous visa problems and things that like the UK really made it complicated for a lot of countries. Well, delegations were not able to join from many places from the global south. So this is one of the main areas of concern. I was within the blue zone for the first week because during the second week I was more involved with the People Summit, with the COP26 coalition. But we could see that, like, even from the inside, there were a lot of organizations headed by women and trying to make sure that this conversation was in fact, like this tension around ACE, the Action for Climate Empowerment, making sure that the language around gender would still be there. This was part of the battle by some of these women's groups, right? So, like, for example, Gender CC did a really good job with that. And ecofeminism is important in the sense because maybe I'll just like go back a little, right? Like when we started talking about ecofeminism, like Françoise Dubon was talking about it, but like I really like the approach that Vandana Shiva has over it, because she talks about making sure that you put life at the center of the conversation, right? So like when you're talking about the organization of like social organization, political organization, economic organization, life is at the center. So how do you sustain life, not profit? And this is something that we could talk about. This is not just about women, but because in many societies, women are responsible, like the major players in making sure that people stay alive, primarily children, it is like really huge concern for women, right? So women end up having these tests because these tests are left over for them. So like maintenance of life is something that's sort of like an afterthought in many societies, especially with capitalism. And ecofeminism is not just ecofeminism, it's ecofeminisms. It's plural. There are a lot of debates around it. The concept of gender changes. The relationship to animals, for example, that changes as well. So, for example, there's a whole discussion around like ecofeminism and animal liberation. I understand here at COP we've had a debate discussing these things as well. So when we're talking about ecofeminisms, now it's really about making sure that the voices that were excluded from the conversation, they're at the forefront. So like, where are the indigenous women, the campesino women, the Black women living in the marginal areas of the cities and suffering from like improper access to healthcare? And these are issues that are all connected to the climate crisis, and they're all connected to the ecological crisis in general. So when we're talking about how we don't have proper waste management in our society, we produce way too much garbage. And it's not just plastic, it's, for example, the fashion industry, and the fashion industry is responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. It produces a lot of like useless waste that goes to landfills and then a lot of women are going to be working informal jobs in those areas. When you have waste management, formal jobs, men are more likely to take up on those jobs. So it would affect women from, being paid very, very cheaply to produce this cheap clothing for the fast fashion industry, and that's producing a lot of greenhouse gases, and then it's polluting in other ways, and women being affected again. So the class issue is right there, and the way that this is still approached when they say, well, gender day at the COP26 from the UNFCCC perspective, it is about just making sure that like we are allocating some funds when in fact we need to talk about the structure of society.
Yeah, of course. And you just mentioned also the animal liberation and the connection between a woman as being a vulnerable part of society. So I'm also interested because you're from Brazil, and now after this global methane pledge, which they had at the COP26, where they said they would reduce methane by 30%, I think, till 2030, and they didn't mention the animal agriculture in this, and the reducing meat consumption, which is one of the most responsible for the emission. And also they were talking about the end and the reverse of deforestation by 2030, but they said that also in 2014. And again, they did not mention the animal agriculture that is responsible for 91% of deforestation of the Amazon. So what is your take on that, on the animal agriculture? And do you think that also this eco-feminist struggle should include the animal liberation front also?
Yeah, this silence is quite expected because when we're talking about animals here, it means connecting not just to the industry level things, but also food sovereignty in general, like what kind of options that people have to eat or not. So Brazil, this pledge is a pledge that is actually quite convenient for the United States, for example, that it's easier for the United States to abide by the pledge because a lot of the methane emissions coming from the US are connected to these leaks in the oil production process. And those are like easier techno fixes, right? When we're talking about Brazil, and if we want to actually reduce methane emissions in Brazil, we need to talk about agrarian reform because we need to contest agribusiness and the role of agribusiness in animal exploitation, in the destruction of the many ecosystems, not just the Amazon, but also Cerrado, Pantanal, all of the ecosystems really in the country, and also how this connects to the violence against indigenous communities and the violence against campesinos. And there are also women at the forefront of these struggles, right? Some of our like biggest environmental leaders in Latin America, it's women involved, it's women fighting and being murdered as well. So this is like a huge matter of concern. And ecofeminism, because it brings this conversation around care and food constantly. For us, this is quite important because Brazil is going through a state of really deep food insecurity right now. And a lot of people actually going like hungry every day, but about half of the population is not quite sure if they can access 3 meals a day. Like we have a lot of inflation connected to food prices, but also because the structure of agribusiness is towards commodities, it's towards exporting. And right now we actually have like one of the biggest scandals is that agribusiness got permission to store meat in containers at the port, waiting to see if China will want to import this meat rather than using this meat there to actually feed people who are going hungry. So it shows that they're not really concerned about feeding the population at all. And that's why family agriculture is so important. But the majority of the exploitation of animals is coming from industrial agriculture in Brazil. And we even have like this whole situation that when they start taking out forests, they just put more cattle over the land to say, well, now this is ours. So we're occupying this with cattle. Like it's a situation in the country where we have like more bovines than we have people in Brazil. And yet we're going through this state of hunger. So we have a lot of women pushing a conversation around food sovereignty, that it's about understanding how we eat, what kind of food is made available to us, if this food is actually healthy, because agribusiness is also pushing for a lot of agrochemicals that are not even allowed in the European Union. And in Brazil, this means, like intoxication really, and like poisoning of people. And seeds, right? And like fighting these certain framework that we have for like industrial food today, where like a lot of what we eat is controlled by about like 10 mega corporations in the world. So bringing this conversation around food sovereignty from the ecofeminist perspective helps to bridge with the conversation around care, and how we could perhaps extend our consideration of care to non-humans, to other species, and what kind of cruelty is involved in that. So like there's like a huge area like on ecofeminism that's connected to like animalist discussions that I think is quite powerful too, and does it from a perspective that's not at all the perspective of like this capitalist veganism that's just about putting like industrial substitutes in some grocery stores and coming from the same industries. There are polluting, there are emitting greenhouse gas emissions, there are also producing methane because they're also exploiting animals in that sense. So it's quite powerful, but I do see it as still very marginal, even in the alternative approaches. So like it's absolutely absent. Like when you like walking around the pavilions at COP26, even when they're talking about the methane pavilion, they talked about animal agriculture, but it was mostly about managing the methane from it rather than thinking about the role of animals itself in this. And but even in the outside part, when we're talking about the movements, this is still quite marginal. We still have a lot of ways to go with this.
And can you tell us something about these women movements that you just mentioned that are against these land exploitation of the Amazon and also the indigenous lands? Are there some powerful women struggle movements, and also are they in a way connected to the left in Brazil? And is there a chance that they can maybe influence something in the near future? Because
Yeah.
I think it's a very, very important thing for the world also, because it's like the Amazon, when you say the Amazon, it's not just like a part of Brazil, but it's also the forest of the whole world, with it going down. I think it will be one of the worst climate changes in the world.
It is like there are a lot of indigenous associations that are finally getting some headlines, which is good. But it needs to be more about more than just getting press headlines. It's about making sure that these concerns translate into policy. They translate into changes in the structure. So one of the worries actually, and I was following some of the work coming from, for example, the Indigenous Environmental Network in the United States and Indigenous Climate Action in Canada, that got together with some of the organizations in Latin America, like from indigenous communities, and they were outside of the Blue Zone at COP, denouncing how carbon pricing mechanisms are actually going to allow for false solutions around net zero. And from this, it's actually not really about understanding nature as something that has value in itself, which is something that's quite important to indigenous communities, but just sticking a price to it and saying that we're going to protect this for now just because we can trade these offsets. So this was one of the concerns. This was quite present there as well. But Latin America and like parts of Africa, like we have like a very interesting network of movements connected to agrarian, like small campesino, small peasant movements really, and indigenous communities. They're connected to La Via Campesina, and it's a huge network nowadays that helps to organize these struggles and to connect these movements together towards food sovereignty, towards proper right to the land and territory, and with a huge health concern. So making sure that we can do this in agroecological ways. And in Brazil, perhaps the most famous movement connected to La Via Campesina is the Landless Workers Movement, and so the MST. And the women there are part of these many peasant movements in Brazil. They do a march called Marcha das Margaridas, which is really powerful. So you see like these women farmers, and they're reclaiming the land and showing how we have to sow the land in a particular way, and we need to feed people because that's a priority. And they take it to the forefront. And then I hope that this serves as inspiration to other parts of the world as well, making sure that we understand the connection to land and territory as something that should be about life first. And that's what Vandana Shiva connects to the issue of seed freedom as well. So when corporations come and they come with GMOs trying to patent access to certain types of food and certain seeds, so you can't grow it any other way, or you have seed invasion, and this affects the infrastructure of even the cuisine of a place, where like you're not allowed to eat these things anymore because you have these institutions and corporations telling the country like what should be actually be grown in that area. Then you need to talk about seed freedom, and seed freedom is a huge concept that's quite at the core of ecofeminism too.
And do these struggles sometimes have a concrete impact? Like, did they have some situations where they actually could push some kind of legacies and policies? Because we know that Bolsonaro's regime has a different way with dealing with it. So I'm interested, is there a chance, maybe, if not now, in the near future, that something concrete can happen in this sense?
Yes, under Bolsonaro has been quite complicated. It's mostly in the sense of stalling things, making sure that things don't get worse, even though we are definitely losing at the front of fighting agrochemicals right now. Like they're just issuing more and more licenses for agrochemicals. But these struggles have been responsible for showing solidarity, which I think is quite powerful. So, like during the pandemic, a lot of people going hungry, and the landless workers movement actually was like growing food, and not just to sell but also to donate food to people who are going hungry. And we're talking about tons of food here, and we're talking about some of the indigenous leaders that have been resisting against Bolsonaro's attempts to change legislation concerning territorial claims by indigenous communities. And they've been doing this for years, and we could talk about even centuries. So it comes in many forms, but in Latin America we see it in other perspectives as well, right? So the right to water, so like the fight coming from rural communities and feminist groups in Chile to like deprivatize water rights, this is quite powerful. And when we had the water wars in Bolivia, in Cochabamba, women were quite powerful there as well, like making sure that no, you can't steal our water, because at that point even collecting water from the rain was considered illegal. So that was a victory right there in Cochabamba too.
And because you consider yourself an eco-socialist, so what would be the like real eco-socialist revolution, but in an international sense? Because you also, I read some of your interviews, and you're very much into an international revolution, because without this internationality, we cannot talk about any kind of real change. And of course, I think the climate crisis and ecology showed us that by solving things in your own backyard will not make the planet not go completely into devastation. So what would be this? It's maybe a hard question, but if you could imagine a real socialist, eco-socialist revolution, we can say eco-socialist feministic revolution, how would it look like?
Yeah, one of the things about like fixing things in your backyard is that sometimes to get materials to fix things in your backyard, you're going to take it from someone else's backyard, right? And this is part of this dynamic that we have between global north and global south, rich and poor countries, developed and underdeveloped countries. And this is one of the main things that we need to fight against right now, because some of the discussions, even around just transition that happen in the global north, don't take into consideration that when we're talking about renewables and we're talking about changing the energy matrix in Europe, perhaps, well, where are these minerals coming from? They're coming from what we call sacrifice zones, areas in the global south that have been marginalized and destroyed for a really long time. And a lot of people don't care about it because, well, we've been mining these places for so long. Why can't we just mine it for longer? And then we're not going to have much left for those communities to work on their own transition, or even to have the chance to say, no, you can't do this in our backyard because this is poisoning our water or something like that. So we need a concept around transitioning that's very internationalist. I've been working mostly with this idea that yes, we absolutely need to mobilize towards a Green New Deal sort of transition. Might not have that name everywhere because it will have different meanings. How you think about transitioning, how you think about a big plan has to do with the history of a place, right? So it might have different names, but in the process, that it's about transitioning from a certain way of producing things that it's very carbon heavy to actually eliminating this over reliance on fossil fuels and animal agriculture that we have in society, and changing the way that we produce our food, the way that we produce our clothes, the way that we produce our technologies as well. That's very wasteful. There's a lot of planned obsolescence that comes with the structure of capitalism and the profit that has to be generated throughout. So this is a conversation about class consciousness in my perspective. So we need to have workers groups involved, and these come in many forms, not just the workers in the traditional industry, but also workers at the land sites, and informal workers who are organizing, who are also demanding their rights, and they also want climate justice. So making this conversation about how we can shift power back into the people and not just these big institutions, because one of the main challenges that we have actually when we're talking about transition is that, especially in the field of renewables, when we're talking about like solar and wind, like the production of solar panels, for example, there are more jobs being created there because there's this push for solar. But when these jobs are being created in the private sector, they're not good jobs. It's like people are overworked and they don't pay as well. So sometimes there might be a rejection from people thinking, well, I don't want to work in that area because those are bad jobs. So if we take this back into the public sector, we make the state responsible, and a big believer that in this process of transition, we do have to like reclaim the state, as complicated as that is. By making the state responsible, we will have more of an infrastructure to make sure that workers' rights are respected and implemented. And through this, we change the structure around property. And in my perspective, especially when we're considering, Latin America, like where I come from, for us, it is talking about the property of land and territory. So we absolutely need to tackle this, because a lot of these violations are there that come from like the mining industry, that come from agribusiness, the destruction of our biomes. This is connected to very unequal access to territory and this constant colonization of land and the violence against the traditional and indigenous communities. So if we're talking about eco-socialism in an internationalist sense, I say that we have to fix these problems from the margins, so we actually have like a proper foundation, and then we'll know like how much of these resources we can allocate in our transition everywhere else.
Yeah, and that's very interesting what you just said, because I come from Serbia, and I'm from Europe, but I'm in a non-EU country, and our country is also in a similar way used in a contemporary colonial way as a place where you can do things without EU regulations. So now we just had yesterday or 2 days ago, they opened earlier a big Chinese factory called Linglong. It's a tire factory, without, of course, any kind of ecological regulations, and it is going to poison the environment and everything. But yesterday they discovered, because they said that they would open new working places for Serbian people, of course, and this was the commercial of our government. But yesterday they found out they brought these slaves, that they were treating these workers. They brought them from China or from Singapore, and then they kept them as slaves in closed without any passports and everything. And then they just discovered that 2 days ago, and now, of course, all the media is trying to cover this up, because we don't have free media in Serbia at all. And now, of course, some media that are free are trying to talk about this. But I think all this colonialism that you're talking about is happening everywhere in all the countries that are not in a way regulated. But then you have like also Rio Tinto coming to Serbia, the mining of lithium, and then you see yourself in a position where you as a country that is so small and doesn't have any kind of ability to do anything. We of course had all these protests and demonstrations and everything against all of this, but nothing at the end happens. So do you think that protests in this classical sense can make any kind of a resistance, or do we have to do something much more radical than that? Because in Serbia, with all of these protests, we haven't done anything at the end, against this kind of things that happened, with the contemporary colonization.
Yes, absolutely. In the sense that when we're talking about the margins, I like this concept because you can have margins everywhere, and we have the margins of Europe as well. So like it's where you like place things that you don't want in the pristine areas, and Serbia is not Germany. Like it's very different in terms of socioeconomic power and geopolitical power, and we need to be quite aware of this when we're discussing global north and global south. That these dynamics are not that geographical, just it's not simply hemispheres. We're talking about dynamics of capital. It's political economy here, and in that sense protests are useful, but they might not really lead to where we want to go. So we need tackle here. And in that sense, like this ecosystem of tactics, they may involve some direct action, and like we are aware of like people closing off roads and bridges, and like in like making sure that you can't sometimes if you're producing things at a factory and you don't want that place there, just make sure that that one thing that's being produced there can't be carried forward, can't be transported somewhere else. So when we have that kind of disruption that actually disrupts the profit that makes a difference. That's why when we're talking, for example, about general strikes, they're quite powerful because they actually put a stop to like the overall normal functioning of the system, where like as long as a general strike lasts. So like this is an option as well, and we need to build alliances, right? So what are the alliances between the people who are purchasing it in one country and how they pressure the governments there, and problems that we have somewhere else. A concern that we've had like of like these conclusions around COP26 is that a lot of people were blaming, for example, India for not being that radical when it came to like phasing out coal, right? Because they were talking more about phasing down coal rather than phasing out coal. And that was very convenient for places like the US or the UK to just like see India. They were so problematic, right?
Yeah.
And yes, of course, we have a huge problem with Modi in India, and absolutely we need to get rid of Modi. And this is a struggle that comes from the people of India, and we need to be solidaristic in that sense, and we need to make sure that that we have some level of system change in that scenario. But we can't use that to deflect from the responsibility of these other countries that come, like they got to Glasgow and they're claiming to be so great and really looking towards the future and making bold promises, but in the fact they want to keep things about the same. So then they just deflect. And that's why we need these alliances between, communities of people who are affected, who are oppressed, and like being exploited in these different areas, putting pressure in that sense. For us in Brazil, it means that, well, it's fine that everyone wants to save the Amazon and that people think that Bolsonaro is a problem, but well, the other places are still purchasing stuff from this agribusiness. So how do you stop that from happening? So when we're talking about building a new pipeline in southern Africa, you can just say, "Ah, we don't want that pipeline," but like, well, but the corporate headquarters they're in Europe, right? So how we're going to pressure that, how we're going to make sure that you can't do that. And in that sense, it was very limited pledge, but it was interesting to see how some countries got together saying that we will stop financing new investments abroad in non-abated fossil fuels, right? Not at home, and the old ones continue and things like that. But like some pressure to make sure that they don't come after it. So if Bolsonaro is trying to privatize the national oil company in Brazil, which is really bad news for climate change, because if it goes private, then they're really going to go forward with extracting all of the pre-salt layer. They're not going to transfer these company into a national energy company towards renewables. If he goes forward with that, it means there are shareholders like from other countries with big capital purchasing it. So we need to have solidarity campaigns in these other places to make sure that these deals implode. And this is really important. We can't just think of struggles as absolutely localized.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think it's also a problem because also when we talk in Serbia about, all the renewable energies, and we should also get rid of coal because it's, of course, a major polluter in Serbia, because you still have a lot of houses that heat in this way. But then how can you tell somebody that has an, average paycheck of 200 euros to go on electricity if he has 200 euros a monthly salary, so or pension or whatever. So I think it's very easy to say it from a position of developed countries, to say to another underdeveloped country, you should get rid of coal, or you should do this, and you're the bad guys, and you're polluting the environment. So I think it's a very, very important question to, as you said, to raise the solidarity between the developing and the not developing countries. And also, whenever I think of this, I also think about the civil disobedience. Or is there a way that all of us can, in a way, be disobedient and not do things in the way that the system is used to? And can we, by civil disobedience, maybe change some things also with ecology? And I always think of this Melville's novel, Bartleby the Scrivener, where he completely destroyed the system by saying, I would prefer not to. So what would you prefer not to do today?
In terms of action,
If you would prefer not to do something that could actually, if a lot of people would not do this, maybe we could change the system by not doing it, not by doing it, but by not doing it.
Yeah, so like the power of refusal, right? So
the power of disobedience. Somebody tells you do it in this way, and you say, nope, I'm doing it another. Yeah.
This, of course, takes us back into the discussion around material conditions, right? Not a lot of people have the power to say no. So, like, if you're going hungry and the only food that's available to you is X, you're going to eat that, right? So, what we need to understand is like the more we structure our society and we get more rights, and these rights would allow us to have a little bit more material conditions to be able to say no to other things. So, like, for example, I say no to eating meat, but I'm an individual. And if more people said no to eating meat, I think that would be powerful. But I also need to couple that with a discussion around food sovereignty, because I need people to have other alternatives for food that don't involve animal exploitation. So saying no, I think it's important, it's quite powerful. It starts a conversation and it leads into action, and you do get something out of it, but it has to be coupled with saying yes to other things as well. So, like, what are the things that you're actually proposing as an alternative? Because we can't just a system is not just about rejecting it. Like, we cannot be anti-capitalist, and like criticizing capitalism is actually quite easy. Capitalism is like feeding us every day with reasons to criticize it. So, like, to be anti-capitalist is quite easy, but to talk about what comes after capitalism, that's much, much more complicated. And that's sometimes even uncomfortable. So we need to be able to reject things, but also to be able to propose things in a way that if we're going to get out of the system, it's not just about replacing the system with something else. It's making sure that the system is so terrible and we have come up with alternatives that are so powerful that the system is not just rejected anymore, it's obsolete. It doesn't even make any sense anymore. And why would we want to go back to it? And this is part of our challenge when we're talking about it. So like this work around agroecology, coming from like feminist, like eco-feminist, campesinos, peasant groups, it's so powerful because it shows that, well, we're not just saying that you need to reject this food that's coming from agribusiness full of agrochemicals because it's bad for your health. We're saying that this other thing here is way better because it allows you to have more options to what you put on your table, and you're going to have like fresher food, and it can be cheaper as well. So yes, we reject something and then we bring something else forward. So when the women from like La Via Campesina in Brazil got involved and like they went into this sort of like this industrial site where they were like manipulating agrochemicals and things like that, and they caused a huge havoc around it. They did that, but it's not just about doing that. That direct action was really important, but it's also showing that we're destroying this because we already have an alternative that's viable, but it's not being accessed by everyone because the political economic structure of the country is privileging those guys and not what's actually healthy for everyone else.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And also, when we're talking about this, in a way, production of goods and overproduction of goods in the world, we also could talk about also reproduction and the right to the women's right to reproduce. And there are many people that choose not to bring children into this kind of a world as a choice. But I think that even in developed countries, women, if they choose not to reproduce, are being in this kind of patriarchal system, treated as they're not worthy enough. So we have this kind of oppression of women in even developed countries, and of course, women in underdeveloped countries have to reproduce. It's just like a must. And what is your take on reproduction today and on reproductive rights in a way, and to women's access to knowledge, what they can and can't do, and also women's disobedience in this sense that they can choose not to reproduce maybe today? And I think it's a very tricky question, but I think we should pose it sometimes.
Yeah, reproductive justice is absolutely a huge part of this conversation. And when we're dealing with ecological crisis, it's actually quite important because every now and then, one of the false bases around climate change that people talk about is like, oh, it's overpopulation, it's too many people. And we have a lot of people on the planet. So like, this is not like when it was like Malthus talking about it a while back. We have a lot of people on the planet. We need to have like proper planning on how to feed everyone, and for that we need agrarian reform. We need to tackle agribusiness, like all these things that we have talked about so far. But we need to talk about reproductive justice. Otherwise, it's usually about placing the blame on poor women and racialized women, saying they have way too many children. See? And we have seen the danger of these eco-fascist discourses. The far right in Europe has mobilized this, in the United States as well, saying, well, it's the immigrant women. Immigrant women have way too many children, so they're taking our resources. And how are we going to actually have proper life and transition to like a more climate friendly scenario if we're bringing all these migrants in? So this is very dangerous, like this eco-fascist conversation, because it does not take into account, first of all, like the idea that this is not about people, it's about profit. like what's actually causing the problem today is how private property is distributed and used to make sure that the rich can consume a lot and they can control and exploit a lot, whereas the majority of society is really living at the margins. This is what we're dealing with. And this is why they would rather talk about this rather than about getting rid of like private jets or private yachts, because it's a huge distraction in that sense. So it's important to talk about reproductive justice, because in the majority of the countries of the world, this is absent. We don't have that. Women won't have access to proper contraceptions. They won't have access to abortion rights either, and they would have pressure from society to become a mother, to be defined by that. And then women who do have the means to access contraception, perhaps, or even countries where abortion is illegal, but women with means are able to get safe abortions and not die, they could be judged, because this role of like being like playing this maternal role is still very much part of the patriarchal system of most societies. So the expectation is there, and then the expectation is there, and then when women do have children, sometimes they're even excluded from leftist spaces, because children make noise, and that's not good for our meetings or for our assemblies or something like that. Or, well, that woman, she's not participating in the organization enough, and so like she might not be interested, but in fact it's because she's left at home doing the care work, and perhaps the male partner is not doing that care work, because there's still a lot of gender imbalances around this, even in households that are considered to be feminist. We know this is part of it. So we need to be quite aware of this problem, and fighting for reproductive justice is important, because also fighting for reproductive justice is fighting for healthcare. It's fighting for children's rights as well, making sure that when women do have children, this is not seen just as a responsibility of that women, like that woman, but also the community around her. And this is quite a strong ecofeminist principle, actually, like understanding that like it takes a village to raise a child. So it's not just about like privatizing care work inside the household to the mother, or perhaps to the mother and father, or to the mother and the mother, the mother and the grandmother, however is the like whatever is the dynamic of that household and the family structure. But understanding that these children are the responsibility of society, and we need to provide the means for this. So like reproductive justice is like quite a powerful framework, because it can lead us into like many other conversations too.
Yes, and it can tell us that we cannot see the end of capitalism without the end of patriarchy and this hierarchical system of binary oppositions, where one gender does one thing and the other does the other. And we have also a question from the audience. So can we talk about feminist ecology and stay in the context of representation? Are more female leaders enough, or do we still want to avoid platforming women like Thatcher or Clinton?
Oh, we absolutely need to avoid Thatchers and Clintons. Absolutely, right? Because it's not ecofeminism is also about intersectionality. So it's understanding that it's not enough to be a woman. It's like, what do you stand for? Because like any woman can be out there and say they represent other women because they are women, but that's just symbolic. Like, what is like what is the substantive representation here? Like, what do you stand for? Like, do you stand for just like the rights of like very powerful old men or other women who are already very powerful and they're going to get more powerful even so? Or it's about creating democratic spaces and making sure that other women have access like to proper work and proper healthcare and fed and children taken care of, and how we restructure society in that sense. So like these conservative women or women who are just standing for the interests of big capital, they don't represent women at all. Actually, I wouldn't even say that like there's any representation there. But they do take advantage of this if they can do so, right? So, and in terms of like Clinton, this was a huge debate in the US when it was the whole discussion about like Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, right? And a lot of these like capitalist liberal feminists like claiming that like how could you support Sanders instead of supporting Clinton because we need a woman.
Yeah.
I'm with her and things like that. Well, like it was enough for you to look at the program and see like who's actually going to fight for women there. And here Hillary Clinton, obviously not. And especially for us, like at the margin of the system, like Hillary Clinton usually means also like places being bombed. It's like bombing other women. So like not a good idea at all. And we need to stay very far away from this kind of approach of representation.
Yes, I completely agree with you on this topic. And if you could now at this point propose some policy measures which could be implemented now concerning concrete climate change action, maybe we can say even ecofeministed climate change action, like at this moment, and that would function in all parts of the world, not just in one part. What would it be?
Oh yes, we could have like very direct incentives for agroecological food growth. This could come like taking out the subsidies from agribusiness and putting the subsidies within peasantry and family agriculture. That's actually very easy to do, and we would have like a direct effect in terms of like raising food sovereignty in these places and stopping the degradation of pasture and stopping deforestation. So, like when these countries were signing this deal to end deforestation, if they do this one thing, they would be a lot more effective than what they're actually claiming that they want to do, which is about just like making forests into offsets. That's the plan that they have. We do have to have like a proper like policy conversation around loss and damage fund and like defining climate finance in that sense as grants as something that like you award so you can deal with these women and like women and men and children that are very marginal already affected and this is something that's actually like quite easy to do. We can bring in some conversations around just like abortion rights. I think that would also make things very simple. You don't need a lot in terms of infrastructure beforehand to be able to legalize abortion, right? It is mostly a moral issue in society than a material issue because we know that in many places, so like when we're considering like Uruguay, for example, talking about other places in South America, once abortion is legalized, there's like a tendency for actually like, abortions to go down because you have like a more open conversation in society about reproductive rights and contraception. So this is important too. Other policy related to this is actually about education on climate change. Because when we're talking about fighting climate denialism, it's not just about fighting Bolsonaro or Trump. It's about making sure that we get the science of this around society and that people understand what the risks are. And this is more common in our everyday lives than just when COP happens every November. It can't just be around this COP calendar that the UNFCCC has. It has to be a really constant thing. So like the conversations around like empowerment around climate change education, this is very much like this is very important. And I think you could go a long way as well because it's not just about showing the numbers that well we need to not go beyond 1.5, but it's also about fighting false solutions and understanding that we don't want forests to be commodified, and we want to make sure that people have proper access to food. And if we do like we do suffer as we are already from extreme weather events, we need to make sure that people have shelter, and we need to make sure that the vulnerable communities are taken care of. So if we have like proper policies around education on climate change on this, it's much easier to pressure into other climate financing, like other types of like funding schemes, and also better decisions and much more advanced than what we saw with the Glasgow Climate Pact.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, for being our guest tonight. You really opened a lot of issues and topics, and for all the people, Sabrina also has a very interesting YouTube channel where you can learn a lot about all of these topics and much more. that we talked about tonight. Thank you so much for being our guest tonight.
Thanks so much. The conversation was great. I love the questions. Thank you. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. And at the end, because this is our final session, our final discussion at the COP-OFF, I want to thank all the speakers and moderators and organizers. It's a very long list of names, so I won't mention all of them, but they know who they are, and the people that watched it know who they are. So thank you so much for organizing the COP-OFF. And after the COP-OFF, we are going to transform these lessons learned into policy demands, I hope. So join Diem and help us adjust our program to save the Europe through the COP-OFF talks in people's gatherings. So join Diem and help us make this transition and help us, of course, fight climate change and help us make an eco-socialist, feminist future. Thank you all.